Hi, and welcome to Wheaton College's Core Book Podcast. Wheaton College is an interdenominational Christian college where we pursue faith and liberal arts learning with passion. Core Book is Wheaton's community reading program associated with our Christ at the Core curriculum. Each year we select a book and invite students, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, neighbors near and far, all communities associated with the college to join in. Believing that we read better in community, we create materials to support readers and plan scholarly and creative events to bring readers together. You can find out more at www.wheaton.edu/corebook. As for this Core Book podcast, this is our first season, a 10-episode read-through of the 2024-2025 Core Book, Homer's Odyssey, with Professor of Classical Languages Alex Loney and Professor of English Ben Weber. Our purpose is to provide accompaniment, community, and nerdy joy to readers near and far. I'm your host, Tiffany Eberle Kriner. Let's read. Hi, and welcome to episode 2. We're adding to our podcast team this week, Dr. Alexander Loney, Professor of Classics here at the college.
Hi, good to be here.
Now is the time for the portion of our show where we invite students to remind us what happens in the books under discussion for this episode. These Sassy student summaries, written by Aequitas Fellows in the Public Humanities and Arts, should get us all on the same page.
All right, gather round, mortals, because we're about to spill the tea on Homer's epic saga, the Odyssey. You might think that we start with the hero himself, but you'd be wrong, because Odysseus is stuck in a cave on an eternal vacay with Calypso. Actually, our story starts with a bunch of Greek gods chilling on Mount Olympus talking trash about the humans. But then, Athena, Odysseus' homie throughout this entire story, convinces Zeus it's time to give poor Odysseus a break and help him get home. Game on. Then we zoom over to Ithaca with Odysseus' son, Telemachus, rocking his self-pity era like, yo, where's my dad at? Meanwhile, his mom Penelope is dealing with a gaggle of suitors, straight-up Disney villains, who are all trying to slide into her DMs. Drama. Athena pulls up and gives Telemachus a pep talk, and tells him to hit the road like the young hero he is. He can find out about his dad and get the honor his name deserves. Man, he needed that. But bless his heart, poor little T tries to put the suitors in their place and gets shut down hard. So he dips. He first stops in Pylos, where he meets Nestor, an old veteran of the Trojan War. He's all, yeah, I know some stuff about the war, but not about your pops. What a load of mumbo-jumbo. Then it's off to Sparta for some, casual wedding crashing. But hospitality is huge in this epic, so Uno reverse card is pulled, and Menelaus and Helen just welcome Telemachus in, even during the festivities. And they go on and on about Odysseus' legendary shenanigans in the war. Telemachus learns that Odysseus is not just AFK, but really stuck with Calypso. Back home, Penelope is just finding out her son's gone. Oh no, my poor baby! And the suitors are plotting to kill Telemachus to get him out of the way of their lounging about and nefarious plans to rizz up Penelope and get the throne of Ithaca to boot. Cliffhanger end.
All right, so books 1 to 4, and as our student summary pointed out, you might think that we would start with Odysseus, but we didn't. One useful question that might help us, help all of you as we're working through these first 4 books, is simply, well, if these first 4 books are not about Odysseus, what are they really about? What are we learning in these first 4 books that we need to know in order to make it through the rest of the epic? So that's going to be our guiding question for the day as we work through these 4 books. I think we'll revisit it and hopefully give it an answer by the end. But for now, maybe it makes sense to just begin with book 1. If I had to sum up book 1 in a word, I suppose it would be drama, that there is drama up on Mount Olympus among the gods. There's drama also down in Ithaca with Penelope, Telemachus, Penelope's suitors. And if I had to assign a purpose to this book, I would say, well, this book is, among other things, it's a book of exposition. It's telling us what the big problems that these characters are facing really are, and also helping us to understand the stakes of those problems. So maybe it makes sense to begin with the text and a passage that actually picks up just after we left off last week, around line 37 in the Robert Fagel's translation, which I'll be reading from. These are Zeus's words to Athena, kind of complaining about the mortals. So this is what Zeus says. How shameless the way these mortals blame the gods. From us alone, they say, come all their miseries, yes, but they themselves, with their own reckless ways, compound their pains beyond their proper share. Look at Aegisthus now, above and beyond his share, he stole Atreides' wife. He murdered the warlord coming home from Troy, though he knew it meant his own total ruin. Far in advance, we told him so ourselves, dispatching the guide, the giant killer Hermes. Don't murder the man, he said, don't court his wife. Beware, revenge will come from Orestes, Agamemnon's son. That day he comes of age and longs for his native land. So Hermes warned with all the goodwill in the world. But would Aegisthus' hardened heart give way? Now he pays the price, all at a single stroke. I think there are a lot of things in this passage that are going on that are maybe helpful for kind of digging into that big question. I feel like I've said a lot, so I'm happy to open it up to you two. So this passage, things around it, what's the poem telling us that we need to know right now?
Well, it's not about Odysseus at this moment.
That's right.
We start off with the sort of head of the gods describing human engagement with the gods, that they're blaming the gods for their suffering and so on. So in some ways, I think that supports some of our earlier thinking from the last episode when we were talking about the question of who causes what problems, right? When we were talking about how complicated it seemed that Odysseus suffered on the sea and worked to save his men's life but failed, but they died for their mistakes. That complicated sense of responsibility, I guess, is echoed again here. So already we have a kind of repetition where there's complex causation. This guy, Aegisthus, oversteps and pays the price for his own actions. And the gods are involved as warners, but do they cause it? Are they blamed for it justly? No, or so says Zeus. So I'm seeing sort of another push toward the moral question here, or the philosophical question, I guess, of whose fault is a thing.
Right, yes. Responsibility, very important here. And I think we're also getting a kind of narrative paradigm about a revenge story, about a series of kinds of events that are going to happen in order to properly pin down responsibility. So, for instance, there's a sense that, well, there's certain customs that one ought not to overstep. So, murdering someone, seducing their wife. I mean, these are sort of out of bounds. And then, even so, you might get someone to come and warn you here. In this case, it was Hermes, right? Come and warn you that, oh, you're about to do something really dangerous, and you could, in fact, suffer for it, right? So there's a kind of justice that's going to come, right? So now we're starting to move into a universe where those who do evil will eventually reap their just deserts for it. So Aegisthus will, in fact, in the end, suffer for the crimes he committed, and he's warned about that, and yet goes through it anyway and commits the crime and is killed. So that's a pattern that the Odyssey sets up for us that we're going to see several times, most especially with Odysseus himself. He's going to be the one that takes on the avenging in the end, as the suitors have been repeatedly warned about their crimes that they're contemplating.
So that narrative structure is based in repetition, right? Like you get a preview of it or a seed of the story and then another version. I love the line in Wilson's translation, Orestes would grow up and come back to his home to take revenge. And that idea is really just setting up just so perfectly. Here's the story of homecoming that Zeus gives us in the first couple of pages of the epic, and then we're going to see lots of more of those as we go through, most centrally, Odysseus's homecoming.
Yeah, and I think this story is a particularly important sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, almost like a negative double to the homecoming, at least, that Odysseus hopes to have. So this is the homecoming that ends in disaster. The story is that Agamemnon, the sort of primus inter pares of the Greek warlords in Troy, comes home not realizing that Aegisthus, who is, has this sort of ancestral connection. I mean, there's a sort of a generational sin problem here, has seduced his wife and plotted to kill him, and so he's murdered in his bathtub after he comes home. And so that's the fear, right? That you come home from war only to discover that everything you love has already been taken away and you're destroyed. But then, of course, as you point out, Orestes gets his own homecoming. Orestes is the dispossessed son of a royal family who's coming back to set everything right. And so in both Agamemnon and Orestes, we get different paradigms for homecoming. And in terms of repetition, this story keeps coming back, and it comes back 3 more times.
Wait, this story?
This particular story, the Agamemnon, Orestes, Aegisthus story.
Which seems to have nothing to do with Odysseus in a way.
Yes, in a way it doesn't, and it does only insofar as Agamemnon, Odysseus, Menelaus, Nestor are all hanging out together in Troy. So this is, one of Odysseus's comrades in arms, right? This is his story. So I guess it's related to him in the sense of it poses this question of, well, where is Odysseus's story going to fit in? A question that I think becomes more urgent as we move forward, but that can await its proper place.
That sounds good. So that's a huge piece of the drama that sets forth the narrative purpose of this book, is the drama of homecoming. Is it going to be okay? Is it not going to be okay?
That's right.
And that's what Zeus's speech and what the drama on Olympus gets us set up for, right? When the gods say, okay, thanks to Athena, it's time to send Odysseus home, but it's not going to be easy. And so we'll go forward there. I wonder if we could turn maybe later in the book, after the drama on Olympus, we move to Ithaca, where Athena comes down to give advice to Telemachus to tell him to go seeking out information about his father, and perhaps to seek out a good name for himself as well. Around, lines 320 and following in Fagles. It's a little earlier in Wilson. I don't know. Where were you thinking, Weber?
Yeah, I think 320 in Fagles. I have some good advice if only you will accept it, which probably words that are particularly powerful in light of what Zeus said about Aegisthus, right?
Totally. You have to listen to the warning of the gods.
Yeah. And then Athena goes on to advise him, go visit old King Nestor in Pulos, go to Sparta to visit Menelaus, learn the news about your father, and depending on what you learn, act accordingly, right? If you hear he's dead, no longer among the living, then come back to the native land you love, raise his grave mound, build his honors high with the full funeral rites that he deserves, and give your mother another husband. And then regardless of whether or not he learns that his father is alive, Athena advises him to kill the suitors, and sort of rounds out that speech with this rousing, you must not cling to your boyhood any longer, it's time you were a man.
You surely heard how everybody praised Orestes when he killed the man who killed his famous father, devious Aegisthus.
That's right.
So that return of this story already becomes a way forward. And we get a kind of moral of the Aegisthus story from Athena. It can help Telemachus when he hears the story grow up, go, then come home and do the right thing, gain honor for yourself and your name by bringing revenge. Which honestly feels a little awkward to me. I feel far away from that kind of ethic in a way that your goal should be to come home and bring revenge.
Yeah,
something
right.
I'm used to thinking as the moral force of a piece of literature.
Yes.
Come home and kill everyone. That's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think we could also think about it as the situation at his home has degraded substantially, and his household is being assaulted. There's this language in here that his household is essentially being eaten up, and his servants and slaves are being treated poorly. So in a way, right, the ethic is, come, let's find a way to restore things back to the situation where Odysseus was the noble king, and he treated everyone like a father, it even says, like a gentle father. And so there's the sense of it's a little bit of a nostalgic longing for the way things used to be. Now, of course, the way that gets cashed out in this poem is perhaps a little disturbing, right? It's the way to do it is through violent revenge. And actually, I think that's really important, actually, that's what the poem ends up doing, is the way this is going to happen is pretty awful. Actually, could have gone differently. They could have perhaps made a settlement and sent away everybody else peacefully, but all these different forces, the gods on the one side, the humans on the other, end up narrowing the path of what could happen as it goes along. Things like this one suitor marrying Penelope, and Telemachus perhaps keeping his house, right, keeping his ancestral home. That's an option that gets thrown away. And they end up deciding, no, the gods and the humans kind of converge on the plan that No, it has to end in a total slaughter. So that's I think is a question the poem raises for us. Is this the way to end this?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, we'll have a lot more to say about this, I would imagine, in subsequent episodes, because what happens later is so interesting in that regard. But I think you're right to highlight, order and disorder, that the gods have a notion of what a properly ordered world looks like. Mm-hmm. And the situation in Ithaca has become deeply disordered. And so, as the son of the royal house, Telemachus' job is to put it back into order. And I'm thinking about, you're saying this feels uncomfortable. So up to that point, oh yeah, that all makes sense. Of course, in this poem, the way to bring order is slaughter. That's the part that feels uncomfortable, right? And indeed, it's a god who's telling him that kill them all. Whereas, can think of other divine injunctions that might maybe suggest that you shouldn't kill all the people who have wronged you, that's not the way to bring back order, but not here.
But the hope is to restore order is in itself a kind of comfort.
Right, yes.
And I mean, order isn't even the right word for me. I think it's sort of a fruitful, just kingdom, the household that is flourishing. Later we have all these visions of the swineherd and other members of the household doing their good work, and there's a kind of fruitfulness there that is being transgressed by the suitor's behavior of consumption.
Exactly.
And so it's not just that so-and-so isn't obeying the right authority or whatever.
Yeah.
It's about the harming of guests, right? When guests come, the suitors ridicule them or treat them badly, and themselves are bad guests. So there's this way where strangers can't be welcomed in, where servants are being mistreated, etc. So there's some bad things going on here.
I will admit I'm highly Augustinian in my vocabulary talking about these things, so yeah, I mean, order in that sense.
Yeah,
right?
totally, right.
And so I would affirm everything you're saying.
All right, well, are we ready to move on to book 2? As we sum up the action of book 2, it's mostly a kind of assembly of the suitors, the getting ready for the trip.
That's the big action of the poem.
Yeah, where Telemachus is kind of calling everyone together as if as the leader, as if as the authority, to try to set down what ought to happen before he goes off.
I mean, it's sort of surprising. I think it surprises everyone that Telemachus is going to take on this role. I was thinking about, what do we get in book 2? And I think we get Telemachus as taking on a kind of new role of authority, showing that he's not going to be a pushover to the suitors. So he tries to involve the community in settling the situation. And it's interesting that we have this kind of sense here in the beginning of the book that, well, they haven't actually really brought people together for a long time, not since Odysseus went away. And so there is a kind of rusty political structure that could solve problems sometimes, but it's not able to do so here.
Oh, so is this one of the failures of another options that you were talking about, the foreclosing of options? The council could work. It worked for the gods. Poseidon will just have to put away his wrath, in book 1, Athena says. And so they sort of settle the matter. We're going to get Odysseus home. They know how to do it. But here, down in Ithaca, at least according to Telemachus's will, what he wants is not going to happen. So the council doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there's this nice parallelism in a way between these kind of, I'll say, almost proto-democratic setups, different people weighing their interests against each other, and it doesn't work out. And so you get Telemachus, encouraged by Athena, showing you strength, and then the suitors are really worried about him. So they begin to make a plot about what to do about it.
All right. I mean, maybe we can go through a few passages. We have a whole set of fiery speeches that would be fun to act out and to play, different characters. But maybe the first one that strikes me after just the assertion of how weird it is for them to have an assembly after so long is when Antinous calls out Telemachus and calls him names right away. Telemachus, you stuck-up, willful little boy. How dare you try to embarrass us and put the blame on us? We suitors have not done you wrong. Go blame your precious mother. She is cunning. And now then we see maybe some of the narrative purpose of the book is to outline some of what Penelope is doing. So yes, there's the parallel councils. One works, one doesn't work. But here, too, we also get more exposition, that backstory. What has Penelope been doing all this time? And it seems like she is like her scheming husband. She, too, is complicated. She weaves and unweaves, literally complicated, layers of fabric and so on. Trying to scheme her way to safety for herself, for her son, throughout this whole process. And so it feels like Antinous, when he says, "Dismiss your mother, let her father tell her to marry anyone his heart desires. Athena blessed her with intelligence," and so forth. It's sort of setting up his idea for what should happen.
I'm not sure how to take Antinous's motives here in the speech, he gives. I think the primary motive he has is to put a wedge between Telemachus and Penelope. He raises this thought. He says, well, Telemachus, you're worried about your patrimony, essentially. The reason that you're worried about that, well, it's really just Penelope's fault because she won't marry somebody, so we just have to keep eating up all of your stuff. It's been 3 years, she could have let one of us marry her by now. And yet it seems Antinous wouldn't be satisfied with the solution that she just goes off to her father and marries one of the suitors, because the problem is that then that leaves behind Ithaca, presumably with Telemachus in charge. And I think what Antinous really wants is supremacy in Ithaca.
Right, and Telemachus shows himself unable to handle the throne right away. He doesn't know how to fight. His father wasn't able to teach him. He gets to the end of this council and is crying, right, about his inability to do what he'd even hoped to, his loss of his father, and so on.
Yeah, and in this world, Weber was talking about the way that he's this royal son who's supposed to come into his kingdom, and there's an element of that. But also in this world, it's not like a highly coded system where you just hand down the throne to the next heir, as they do in the British royal system. They've got it listed out to 200 or 300 different heirs in line. It's not like it automatically would go to Telemachus. The political structure is a lot looser, and so he could easily lose his rule just if somebody else shows themselves to be better able to mobilize and lead the people of Ithaca behind them.
Yeah.
And the way you do that is by having signs of authority. So one of those signs of his power and authority would be, well, for the suitors, it would be marrying Penelope. That would be a pretty strong way to help bolster your claim. Just occupying the house and having the various slaves and attendants support you there would also help. Just being strong and a powerful warrior, which clearly, as we read here, Telemachus, not yet. He's not yet there. There's a lot of kind of just power negotiation going on here, I think. That's kind of what's at stake between Antinous, Eurymachus, Telemachus here.
Now, one question I had about those dynamics was the role of fate or prophecy in that, too. There are a few speakers who talk about prophecies or portents as having a role in the adjudication of power, the sort of assigning of power in this uncertain situation. For example, Halitherses, I do not know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but when he says, Odysseus will not be absent from his friends before long, I told him when he left he would suffer and all his men would die, but in the 20th year he would come home, and now it's coming true. And that seems to have a role in the occurrences, right, the fate of someone. But then, the suitors say back, many birds go flying, not all are meaningful, which is a great line. So another factor, I guess, in the wielding of power.
Right. Absolutely right. So that's like if you have people who are able to call on and evoke various signs, right, that show that something is ordained by the gods, then you're likely to be able to have success at that as well.
Yeah, I was struck by that moment when Halitherses, he's the best at reading bird signs, and he says, oh, this is a bad omen for us, right? But then Eurymachus gives his own prophecy around line 210 and figures, here's my prophecy bound to come to pass. If you old codger, wise as the ages, talk him round and cite the boy to riot, he'll be the first to suffer, let me tell you. and you, old man, will clap some fine on you, you'll weep to pay, a fine to crush your spirit. So Eurymachus has this very defiant, well, my prophecy is worth just as much as yours. But I think it goes back to what you were saying before, Lonnie, about the kind of characters who show impiety sooner or later will get what's coming to them. And that's a part of the kind of moral landscape of the poem, even if it feels really distant from Telemachus's experience right now.
Well, I think this sort of narrative purpose of book 2, then, it seems like we're circling around the idea that it's kind of to help us see why some solutions might not work, to help see further the trouble that requires Odysseus to come home, and to give us at least some little mini bits of hope that he might from some of these portents. And indeed, when Telemachus sets off or gets ready at the end, he is hoping to find out just that. So let's move on to book 3.
Book 3 is King Nestor. Telemachus gets away. He sails to Pulos, which is where Nestor rules. Nestor is famously old.
Yes. He was already old when he was fighting the Trojan War.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, and so he's even 10 years older now. Yeah.
Yep. And so, Fagles gives this book the title King Nestor Remembers, and he's old, he has a long memory, and he has a lot to say. But this is sort of Telemachus's first real effort to put into action Athena's plan for him, right? Meet your father's companions, learn what there is to learn about where he is, whether he's dead or alive, but also, I think, about who he was and what it means to be his son. And I would circle back, I guess, a little bit to my comment before about Telemachus being the son of a royal house. You're absolutely right that his situation's really precarious, and there's no guarantee that the throne should pass to him in some sort of, modern British monarch-type way. But it does seem to me that folks who are members of sort of the elite have a kind of concomitant obligation to behave in certain ways and to do certain things.
Oh, yeah.
So, he's got a big burden of expectation on him because of who his father was. And he understands it to a degree, I think, in books 1 and 2, but books 3 and 4, he learns a lot more about what that really means.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, there's this, the world of the Odyssey is a lot like the world of the Iliad, and that kind of obligation you're talking about is certainly felt in the Iliad, this kind of noblesse oblige, that, we're, we have a certain power and station in society that is the elite do, and we have to kind of go out and risk our lives on the front lines for our society. But then also this expectation, right, that you're supposed to stand up and lead your people, and that you're sort of in some sense responsible for them as their leader. Yeah.
And yet the first thing that they do when they see Nestor is have a little devotions to start it off. Now guests give prayers of thanks to Lord Poseidon and pour libations for the god. And given that Poseidon is Odysseus' big enemy, this seems really interesting and important. Maybe a little bit of what Odysseus did to get in trouble, but a kind of lesson of how the true nobility will behave piously.
Yeah, I think piety is part of that weight of expectation. I mean, I'm always amused by the moment when Athena prays to Poseidon. It's sort of a delightful thing. It's around line 60 in Fagles, but just before that prayer, Pisistratus, Nestor's son, puts the cup in Athena's hand, disguised, I think, still as Mentor here.
That's
right?
Yeah.
Because Mentor is older than Telemachus. And it, in Fagles' translation, says, Pallas rejoiced at the prince's sense of tact in giving the golden wine cup first to her. So that he's following the sort of code of obligation. Well, code is too strong a word. He's following the kind of norms of obligation here correctly, and it pleases her to see that.
It's not a coincidence that the name mentor is mentor, right, in English.
That's right.
Right, so it comes from this character, ultimately.
Yeah.
Right? That is to say, Athena plays this role as a kind of teacher, a mentor, to Telemachus through these books in the guise of the human character mentor.
So what do we learn then from Nestor's story, or what does Telemachus learn from Nestor's story? One of several stories that we hear in these next couple of books.
Nestor's story is long. And it's another part of this book that amuses me is right around, I think it's 113 in Fagles. Telemachus has just made his request If ever my father, Lord Odysseus, pledged you his word and made it good in action, once on the fields of Troy where you Achaeans suffered, remember his story now, tell me the truth. Nestor, the noble charioteer, replied, at length. And indeed, like, this is true.
Yes.
Well, I mean, and further, right, if you stayed here 5 years and kept on asking how many things the fighters suffered, you would get bored and go back home again.
That's right.
Hilariously sort of old codgery feel, you know.
I mean, also very poignant if we think back to the proem, right, and all the pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea. That, like, the amount that Odysseus, that Nestor, that Agamemnon and Menelaus, the amount that they suffered is inexhaustible. That experience of war is such an incredible weight that they're carrying around with them. I think it does become a joke. I do think the Odyssey is genuinely funny at points. But, you know, like many really good jokes, it's funny in part because it has this sort of serious side to it. And I actually find the beginning of that story to be really poignant. When he says, so many battles round King Priam's walls we fought, so many gone, our best and bravest fell. And he starts to enumerate the names of the mighty dead, right? There Ajax lies, the great man of war. There lies Achilles too, and that's all he says about Achilles, maybe because nothing more needs to be said about Achilles, right? He's just so famous. There Patroclus, skilled as the gods in council, and there my own dear son, both strong and staunch, Antilochus, lightning on his feet, and every inch a fighter. There is this sort of mournful tone to the story, but I wonder, and maybe I'm overreading here, but I think I want to put this out there because I think it comes back at other points in the poem. If there's also just a little bit of, and I mean, I know nostalgia is a loaded word in this context because it contains in it that word for homecoming, right? Nostos. Yeah. But there is a kind of nostalgia for the war itself that you sometimes hear in the words of the men who fought it. And that's something that Telemachus sort of needs to know because it's part of who his father is, but it's also something that he hasn't experienced, and therefore it's very difficult for him to, I would imagine, to come to terms with.
It strikes me that the assertion that we tell a story to recount suffering is both strange to me and interesting to me as a kind of theory that the poem is setting out. Right in the beginning, we have Odysseus described as the man who suffers a lot. And here, when Nestor is telling his story, the central thesis statement is, like, we suffered so hard and so long, let me tell you about it. Right. And maybe Telemachus needs to hear this because he is just growing up and maybe he isn't used to any more than a certain kind of suffering of not having your father with you, or the personal pain of loss in your household. But we tell stories to tell our suffering is a bold statement of poetics. Right? Like, why would you do that? What is it for?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's to, maybe this to use a kind of contemporary psychological phrase, I mean, sort of to integrate the suffering within your whole ongoing life. And I sort of make that something that is now part of your soul, say, part of your way of encountering the world now. And this is a kind of a notion that's in a lot of ancient Greek literature. I mean, there's this nice little phrase you get in the Agamemnon, the pathemathos, which is to say, lesson through suffering. You learn and become who you are, both through the suffering, but then I think importantly in this poem, as you're pointing out, reflecting on that suffering and becoming better in some way through it.
And sometimes we do learn from suffering, like if we're talking about Ajax, if we're talking about Achilles, or even the story of, say, Odysseus. These stories have lessons to teach us, or to teach Telemachus, I guess. But it doesn't erase the pain or even the greatness of the fighters themselves, who may have made mistakes, who may have done really evil things even. It's complicated, I guess, is maybe how I would think about that. And to tell the story again lets it be something other than a fable, maybe? Something other than a maxim or proverb. It allows the pain to be felt significantly in some way.
Yeah, and I think in that way, moments like this kind of are an important complement to the councils that we've been looking at, where in the councils you actually have more or less sort of propositional arguments about what is correct. So-and-so is to blame, so-and-so isn't to blame. And part of the sort of education we get through those is adjudicating those different arguments about who's at fault for a particular thing or whatever. So there's a kind of a moral reasoning. If I could sort of put it crudely but simply, passages like this are interesting because they seem more interested in awakening a kind of like moral feeling What is Achilles' legacy? There lies Achilles, too. We'll have a chance to hear from him later in the poem, so I don't want to prejudice that. But, but here we don't. What does it mean that, Achilles made his choices and died? What does it mean that Patroclus did the same? What about Nestor's son? And to just sort of invite us to sit with those stories without offering a series of arguments about them, I think is a different way of getting us to engage with the ethical texture of the poem.
Now, in some ways, when Nestor comes home, his homecoming is simple or straightforward in some ways, right? He gets there. He's okay.
Yes, right. And he is actually, again, another Tor name. So that Tor that's an agent suffix in the Greek. And so Nestor is the bringer or the homecomer, one who brings home or comes home.
Homecoming king.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice.
Awesome.
That's nice. Okay. You were thinking of that one up.
This morning.
Before, yeah.
Yeah.
You're ready to deploy.
Very proud of myself.
So that name is from this Greek word for return. And that's important in this poem. And then we start to see in this book 3, and then we'll also see in book 4, some stories about homecomings. So Nestor is the simplest in some ways, but he tells stories of other homecomings, and we'll soon hear others from Menelaus in book 4. The word in Greek for a homecoming is a nostos. It's both this term for the act of coming home, accomplishing a safe return home, but it's also the term for stories about a return. You can tell a nostos, a tale of a return, and that's in fact what he's about to do here. And so you'll see the parallel then to what's going on in the Odyssey as a whole, which is in great part a nostos, right? It's this story of a return home.
Mm-hmm. And this is a simpler one of a guy who lost a lot but made it home safe. And Odysseus is a more complex version of this, or it's one that's still in progress that we have hope for.
Yes, that's right. We're sort of in the middle of that story, of Odysseus' story, but now we're getting some sort of full ones told in books 3 and 4 here.
So shall we move on to then book 4 with another of these? I feel like we're seeing pairs of stories or repetitions of stories already throughout, and we have Nestor's and then Menelaus's. So we start out book 4 with the movement to Sparta, Helen and Menelaus, and they crash the wedding, are received respectfully and kindly, and then have another set of stories. So what then is the purpose here? More of the same? This is just a long night and we're trying to increase our word count, or what? Paper writers all know.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, because I wonder about this, teaching both when I teach the Odyssey in translation and when I teach Old English literature, because it also seems to be the sort of oral formulaic thing. On the one hand, you're just trying to keep your audience spellbound, right? Like, give the people what they want is always present as an explanation for why the poem is a certain way, but it never strikes me as a sufficient explanation, right? Like, you don't want to, as a scholar or an interpreter, you don't want to just sort of dismiss things on the basis of, oh yeah, he was just had 20 minutes to go till dinner time and was like trying to keep the kids out of trouble or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's always a challenge to know, how many of the interpretations that we hold so dear are sort of fraught because of this question. I've now shown my card, so I don't think it's just a repetition, but I think the repetition's important. We get another version of the Aegisthus story. Nestor had one for us too. Menelaus has yet another one. Makes sense, because Agamemnon was his brother. But also Menelaus' own homecoming was a lot more complicated, right?
How so?
So Menelaus' story, he tells it, I guess, at some length, but he ends up stuck on Egypt for a considerable amount of time and has to sort of wrestle the god Proteus down to get some relevant information in order to make it home. The other thing that complicates Menelaus' return home is that he's married to Helen. And I mean, like, that doesn't make it more difficult logistically, but it makes his home situation a lot more complex. How hard is it to get home is a significant question in this poem. What home are you coming back to is another significant question in this poem. And Menelaus' home is much more challenging, I guess, than Nestor's. And I'm thinking of, the really odd way that even Helen presents herself, which it's hard to know, I guess, what to do as a translator, but I think Fagles has her refer to herself as a shameless whore. You know, how does Helen on the one hand accept some kind of role in events and on the other hand also communicate that so much of what happened didn't really have anything to do with her? So it goes back to this question of who's responsible for what. I guess I would say as a whole, book 4 seems to be a lot more complicated in the kinds of homecomings it's sort of dramatizing or thinking about.
So if I'm hearing you right then, in Nestor's story we get a guy who's suffered a lot and come home. So he has his own trauma, his own stress related to the war. But then when Menelaus comes home, the journey itself is problematic and has to do with piety and the gods and wrestling Proteus and all that, right? Like how do you figure out what you've done wrong and manage that? But then also there are problems on the home front itself. And especially problems related to husband and wifeness. And the social sort of riders thereon, all the social roles and problems associated with it. Wilson talks about Helen saying, I wished Aphrodite had not made me go crazy when she took me from my country and made me leave my daughter and the bed I shared with my fine, handsome, clever husband. So puts the weight on Aphrodite there, or some of the responsibility anyway on Aphrodite there. So that too has a sense of weird socialness. How do we understand what she did too? But I like the idea that we're sort of increasing in complexity, increasing in our ability to handle in our minds a set of possible problems.
So I do think book 4 is one of the important functions is to introduce Helen also as a potential foil for Penelope, because Helen is, as we've been saying, complicated. She has that. One of my favorite moments is this dueling pair of stories that Helen tells and then Menelaus tells about what happened, at Troy in the final days, right? Helen paints herself as helping Odysseus out when he sneaks into the city to try to get some intelligence. Then Menelaus tells a story that makes it seem like Helen was trying to betray them by adopting the voices of their wives, circling around the horse. And so there's a bit of a puzzle about who is Helen really? Did she go off of her own free will to Troy? Or was she sort of compelled in some way by the gods, or by humans for that matter? Was she just forced to do what she was to do? And that is interesting, partly because it raises questions about both her fidelity as a spouse and then like her agency in the whole thing, which are relevant to what we are going to wonder about Penelope. Is she going to remain faithful to Odysseus? That's kind of an open question in the narrative here. What role, how much kind of agency and can she have? And how does she exercise that? And maybe one thing that Helen does, maybe one way she exercises her agency is being kind of mysterious to the people around her, holding her cards close to her chest. Maybe Penelope is doing something like that too through these scenes, right? She's trying to play both sides in a way. We'll see later on in the story. But I think that's important to see Helen here. And I think continue to think about her as a possible Penelope figure.
I think you're right. And then the other question that I tend to emphasize when looking at this book, and indeed this section, I think, and this actually will carry over into what we want to talk about next time, is just what is a functioning aristocratic or royal? Somewhat anachronistic terms, but they serve. What does a functioning marriage look like? Especially in this Mycenaean Greek culture, where the realm, the place and people someone rules, is kind of an extension.
Such a medievalist.
Yeah, well, we are what we've been taught to be. So I think that question, right, of, what is a functioning marriage? What kind of home does it create? How does that home then kind of radiate out into the public is a really key one. And that this book is kind of putting that question front and center.
To the overall question of homecoming, right?
Yes.
Like that what sort of relationships you have in your household really bears on the sort of Nostos that you will be able to achieve.
That's right, yeah. And the stories that people will tell about you later on.
That's right. Well, maybe this is a good time to kind of sum up. We've been in these 4 books and what we think their purpose are. We didn't start with Odysseus. He's in a cave somewhere with Calypso.
That's right.
And instead we start with Telemachus in the Telemachiad, these 4 books. So if we had to set forth our 3 theses, or maybe they'll all be 1 thesis if we all agree, what are these books then doing? What is their function in the poem as we've talked them through? Do you want me to start?
All right, give us your.
Okay. So, as maybe the least familiar reader with the poem, I will say that I felt like Telemachus was in some ways standing in for a reader who needs to be educated into the moral universe of the poem. So we learn by snippet tale and by long tale again and again what you're supposed to do and be. In order to be a person who has right piety, you should do this and not do this. I feel instructed about social relationships, about hospitality, about how to negotiate, how to engage with members of your household. So I feel morally instructed by the poem so far. And because we focus on Telemachus, I get like the baby version, right? As he's kind of growing up into it, so am I as a reader. So that's maybe part A of my thesis. And part B of my thesis would be that these books have a poetics type purpose. They reflect on storytelling even as they do it. There's so much storytelling and alluding to different stories. They're thinking about what it means to sit around and tell stories about what you've lost and about what it means to come home and all of that. I'm not prepared fully to elucidate, I think, what the instruction is, but I've been surprised to see suffering as central to what a story is. Because I think the reputation of the Odyssey is adventure story, right? There are monsters, there are many dangers, toils, and snares to come through. And I'm expecting plot, but what I'm finding asserted is suffering. And I'm moved by that as a reader to reflect on what poems can offer a community vis-a-vis suffering. There's probably more to think about and say about that, but that's my thesis so far.
No, that's great. And I mean, I appreciate your mention of the monsters and the adventure, because they're there, but it is true that many people, when they just think of the Odyssey, what they're really thinking of is books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey.
Totally, that's me.
Like,
yes.
that's, it's only 4 books out of 24. I mean, there's so much more to this poem than that. So yeah, I would pick up really on Homecoming that I guess the simplest form of my statement is that these books are about what it means or what it might mean to come home. So how do you get there? What's waiting for you when you get there? What do you need to do? Who do you need to be in order to return home from something like the Trojan War? I think I'll have ample time in future episodes to kind of explicate that argument, because I think once Odysseus actually, gets home, there's a lot more to say about it. But even in these first 4 books, the poem is kind of posing that question. And then the other thing that I feel is happening, and I think our conversation has pointed to it pretty well, is that sort of artistically, we're gradually ratcheting up the stakes and the complexities of that Nostos, right, of that Homecoming.
Yeah, and I think I would kind of jump on the end of what you were saying there, Weber, to say that I think it dramatically and sort of narratively fills this function of setting the stakes of what's involved on Ithaca, principally. The situation is pretty desperate. It can't be easily solved absent Odysseus's return. And in fact, it's going to look really dire for Telemachus, right? We didn't talk about the very end of book 4. We go back to Ithaca. They're setting up an ambush. This kind of leaves on a bit of a cliffhanger. Like, we don't know what's going to happen there. It's about as bad as it could get and still be in some way salvageable. And so it's really kind of ratcheting up the tension, showing us the ways in which Odysseus is really needed and how important his return is going to be for restoring that community. And it does so also by giving us this interesting character Telemachus. It's nice that he kind of gets his own bit of the story. It's almost a bit of fan service for Telemachus, or that he seems like a nice guy that we want to hear more about. And so that gets kind of put into this story too.
Well, good. We'll unfold some of these in future episodes, I think, as we go through. Well, next episode, we'll be dealing with books 5 through 8. What happens in those?
We catch up with Odysseus, and without, I guess, saying too much more, in my view, husbands and wives, homes, really important stuff.
All right, here we go. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening. This is the time in our show where we share with you some of what we're hearing about how the Odyssey is showing up in culture. Remember, these aren't recommendations exactly, more gossipy cultural hearsay. And we'd love to hear from you, too, about what you're reading and seeing at core.studies@wheaton.edu. Hey, have you heard about Alice Oswald's book of experimental poetry, Nobody? A tiny volume, it would fit in your pocket on any voyage. It's a hymn to the sea, a spin-off from some lines of Book 3 of the Odyssey. When Agamemnon leaves for Troy, he leaves a poet ordered to protect his wife Clytemnestra, but Aegisthus, the seducer, left the poet to be eaten by birds abandoned on a desert island. We may imagine that poet to be Oswald's speaker of these watery waves of lines. If you'd like to hear more about Nobody, find links in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Do you have questions about the Odyssey that you'd like our Core Book podcast team to consider? Send your questions to core.studies@wheaton.edu by December 1st, and we'll consider them for our question and response episode, the last of our season. We might not be able to get to them all, but we'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week with more nerd love. But if you miss us before then, visit www.wheaton.edu/corebook. Or better yet, find someone to share the Odyssey with. With Core Book, as with all books, we read better together. The Core Book podcast is a production of the Core Book program at Wheaton College in partnership with the Aequitas Fellows Program in Public Humanities and Arts. Aequitas PHA is a creative studio and scholarship program that brings together 4-year cohorts of undergraduate student artists, theater makers, dancers, musicians, writers, and all manner of scholarly nerds to build publicly engaged projects in the humanities and arts. You can find out more about the program and all the Aequitas themes, including global public health, sustainability, politics, philosophy and economics, and urban leadership at www.wheaton.edu/Aequitas. That's AEQUITAS. You can find out more about Core Book and look at our years of archives and reading materials for all our core books, from Shishaku Endo's Silence to Marilyn Robinson's Gilead and Daniel Nayeri's Everything Sad is Untrue at www.wheaton.edu/corebook. Our podcast is produced by the endlessly capable Emma Smith. Music is by Tristan Guzman. Art is by Lily Groves and Cecilia Waidatt, with audio editing by Emma Smith. Our Sassy student summarizers are Zoe Foster-Whiddon, Houston Heinrich, and Emma Smith. Special thanks to the Wheaton College Aequitas Fellows Program in Public Humanities and Arts, Bailey Garrison, Mariah Sray, Anna Porter-Puckett, Karina Adamowicz, Linda Bretz, Sray Austriaco, Rebecca Larson, Les Barker, and the Wheaton College Marketing and Communications Department.